Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to complete our last exploration on Tartaria as a whole. In the past, we've looked at the greater glories of Tartaria. We've explored what it may have looked like, and these are just theories because the reality is we have no idea exactly what it looked like. But we have a good idea of what it may have looked like based on the remaining architectural examples that we have that endured to our own civilization in the 5th era. And yet, for whatever reason, the civilization of the 4th era, what we call Tartaria on this channel, is a civilization that we find very alluring. We also find that many of the greatest achievements in humanity and its history seem to be reflected in Tartaria, and the actual intention behind this civilization, which was to achieve balance within the individual, but also to achieve balance between the individual, the cities, and nature. It's certainly something that we can see in our current civilization that we tend not to have balance. At least not a balance that we can recognize. We oftentimes see ourselves being moved to polar opposites on any and every issue, whether it's the differences in our ideology or our appearances or even our economic systems. And as a result of our deference to this type of conflict, we see our civilization in ruins. We see the ruins of the previous civilization of Tartaria. We know that it was a great civilization that had achieved wondrous heights, a unity of purpose within humanity. But how exactly did it fall? In the past, we posited who was truly responsible, and we came to a little bit of a conclusion that perhaps we were responsible, or at least our progenitors were responsible. Yet, looking deeper into the history of Tartaria, I think we can still see the very forces and their effects in our current civilization that caused the fall of the previous civilization. If you think about what every civilization aspires to be and do, it's to grow and to increase in size and knowledge. And while the people of Tartaria looked within themselves, they sought more lands to explore. There are accounts and myths that they opened portals to other lands, that they attempted to access areas that they didn't have access to. In effect, they had reached the physical boundaries of their realm or their lands, and they sought to explore others. It was in this exploration, though, that they opened a portal to a dark land, and they allowed some other dark beings to reach their land through this portal. By the time that they had realized what they had opened up, they found themselves facing an entity with a power that they couldn't even begin to imagine. An entity that seemed to reflect some sort of anti-deity, or an anti-god, if you will. This anti-god quickly filled the land and turned the people of Tartaria against themselves. But how was this achieved? What happened that caused the great civilization that was unified in purpose, that had achieved balance, to completely fall apart and ultimately be destroyed? We can still see the remnants of Tartaria everywhere we look across the lands. Castles, ruins, some buildings that are kept in better shape than others, and even older remnants of the buildings of previous eras. When we look at our 5 eras theory, we start with our contemporary era because that's where we are now. And we examine all of the aspects of our contemporary era. People will tell you that some things don't apply to Tartaria and some things do, but the reality is everything does. Because we are descended. We are the progeny of the civilizations that came before us. It doesn't matter if there were 4 resets, 5 resets, or 2,000 resets. We are still the same people. It's safe to say that there have been vast changes within both ourselves and our civilization and the society. When we look at the 4th era, the Tartarian civilization, we examine their great triumph. But now we're going to look at the decline and fall. How did this great civilization erode and disintegrate, ultimately turn upon itself, and then found itself isolated and destroyed by the forces that it had exposed itself to in its attempts to explore new lands, to access other lands? And we can see the great tragedy of the destruction of the once great examples of architecture. And we can see the remnants of it, even perhaps in some of the images that we have that perhaps were not altered from the 19th century. The height of the 4th era, or the Tartarian civilization, is something that we believe dreams are composed of. It's very difficult to properly imagine or visualize exactly what these images were in this civilization. The finest examples of architecture and society working together, people achieving balance, looking inward for internal strength, and most importantly, possessing self-discipline. What we know as our paradigm in our current civilization is that we have external discipline. In other words, external institutions, individuals enforce discipline upon us. We do not seek to be self-disciplined. We tend to be discouraged from seeking self-discipline. And what this leads to is when you rely on another force, authority, or individual to impose discipline upon you, it means that that entity is ultimately dictating how you're going to live your life. They're going to tell you what's important, and they're going to do it in the most insidious ways possible. Even though you may be consciously aware of it, even though you may see it, and you write about it and you lament about it every day of your life, you're oftentimes willing to accept it because you've been conditioned to accept it. You've been conditioned that there can be nothing better in the past, or that in the past everything just fell apart because the previous civilization was corrupt. And indeed, a lot of what we're allowed to or encouraged to explore when it comes to a previous civilization was the ways in which it was corrupt. Because you'll see that the corruption is reflected in our current civilization, and even in our supposed recorded mainstream account, you will find the examples of corruption. Yet contrast that with what we see as the dream of Tartaria, or the Fourth Era civilization. And that dream is a people who had self-discipline, who had self-restraint, and yet at the same time achieved balance. They were able to overcome their physical differences and all the other differences and live in a state of balance. Now, of course, this has to be mocked, this has to be derided, because this is a threat to the current power structure that we have in our Fifth Era civilization. No one is supposed to know that they have greater capabilities as an individual, that they have spiritual strength which cannot be matched in any way, shape, or form. Yet looking at the examples that we have of the Fourth Civilization, with the great achievements in architecture, we'll be told that somebody else had to do this. It was a divine being, or it was some form of artificial intelligence, which nowadays seems to be a substitute for a divine being for many. And if that's what you choose to believe, then so be it. But we have to remember that many of the greatest works of art that depict the wonders of the past came from a human being. It came from a human's creative inspiration. The tales of fantasy did not come from some artificial intelligence. They came from human creativity, the spirituality within every single human being that no doubt comes from some sort of divine power. And while I may not have spoken of it directly in the past in the channel, I've certainly alluded to it. And the reality is, our search for understanding and who we are comes from within. It does not come without. And ultimately, that was the great mistake. That was the mistake that was made in the past that led to the eventual destruction and downfall of Tartaria. When you look at all the myths and all the examples of what may have been in the past, even that does not match the grandeur for what was in reality. Because we can look across the lands and we can see great examples of horrific destruction in Siberia, in the northeastern portion of Siberia. And we'll have a designated historical account that'll tell us what was there, and will tell us about the great kingdoms that were there. But I don't believe that at the height of its civilization that a person, a citizen of Tartaria, the civilization, or whatever it was actually called, because remember that we just use that name as a placeholder because we don't know what language they spoke. We don't know what exactly they called their civilization or how they divided their lands, and perhaps they didn't divide their lands at all. They didn't believe in such a concept. It's always interesting when you look at the concepts of certain cultures that we're told believed in boundaries on land, but then conversely we're told that they did not believe in the boundaries of land, that land had now boundaries, that land was for everyone. Now you might be arguing, well, how could anybody live in such a system where there's no division? Well, somehow we manage to live in cities now where there's no actual division, although we believe there's a division of ownership. Is it real, or is it just what we accept? These are all questions that we have to explore. We also look at the concept of Camelot and King Arthur and the legend of Excalibur. I believe that that particular myth alludes to what was very likely the last legitimate regime of Tartaria, or the civilization that preceded ours. It was not based upon one person's vanity, or one person acting as king. Yes, there was King Arthur, but King Arthur didn't see himself as some sort of divine monarch. What he ultimately saw himself as was a person who worked for the betterment of the entire civilization. That was indeed the very crux of the idea of the Round Table. That everyone was equal, no one was above any other, and that the role of being the leader was simply a function. It was not some sort of near divine being that was to be worshipped. Ultimately, Arthur sacrificed himself for what was and the dream of what could be. And it's those very words that we have to remember. Things were once very great in the past, and they could be very great in the future. The way things were subverted was by kings and titles. Once the entity that managed to infiltrate Tartarian civilization, or the Fourth Era civilization, grabbed hold, one of the first things it seemed to do was to subvert individuals. And where that started was many individuals taking the title of king. How much do we value the title of king? How much do you see the use of king this and king that? King Charles, King Henry, King Charles the Simple, King Charlemagne. It goes on and on. Although Charlemagne had himself declared emperor, it doesn't really matter because what you have is this obsession almost with titles. Now, before anybody says that I'm degrading anybody who puts value in titles, that's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is that when you embrace the importance of titles, you have to be cautious because before you know it, you are suddenly putting the certification of a larger group on your own self-value. In other words, the titles that endure to this day. I remember there was a political science teacher during his class who was explaining to his students that we don't use titles in the United States anymore. For example, you would call me Lord Schmidt if we still use titles. And then one of the students quite accurately quipped, yes, but we still have to call you Dr. Schmidt. Everybody got a good chuckle out of that, including myself. But what it says, though, is that if you value titles over your own individual value, then you're letting someone else dictate what your value is. And that is not what life is about. We dictate our own value. And no matter how many people try to tell you fallacies, how many people try to convince you that they're doing the right thing, or whoever dresses up in kingly robes with their wonderful adornments and decorations, there really is no difference between one human being or another. And one of the other things that caused the Fourth Era civilization to fall apart was not just the embracing of titles and indulgence in self-vanity. It was also the change in identity. What we saw was suddenly a more increased political division, a geographical division within the lands, dividing up the lands into many different principalities, and suddenly changing the ways in which they were facilitated, and even embracing the concept of being governed. If you have a people who are self-disciplined, what need is there for governance? But if you have a people who are not self-disciplined and have to be disciplined by an external force, then you have every great need for governance, which involves individuals taking the titles of king and dressing up in all the pageantry that you can imagine, with flowing robes and very nice tights. And we have room for queens too, or it doesn't really matter. Anybody can call themselves a king. It doesn't matter what your gender or your background is, or it's interesting how it even transcends cultures, that pretty much anybody can be declared a king for any point in time, or an emperor. And indeed, many of the symbols of this endure to this day. So what you have that's been effectively undermined, and what was no doubt effectively undermined in the Fourth Era civilization, was the concept of leadership. Instead of a leader seeing themselves as a servant of the people, they looked to themselves as divine beings. The defense forces of Tartaria were subverted as well. Now, I've long had an exploration looking into the military orders that we have of the medieval period, and not just focused on Europe, but all the other military orders across the lands. Yet, we can see a great example in the military orders that we believe are associated with Europe, even though they operated extensively in what is today the Middle East, such as the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, the Knights Hospitaller, all the other military orders that we have. The one that tends to get the most attention, though, is the Knights Templar. What we're told about the Knights Templar in our official history is that they were a military order that was founded for the Crusades, for the European or the Latin nations, as they were called at that time, to recapture the Holy Land for Christendom. And in their foundation, though, we seem to have views of chastity, views of poverty, and that they were specifically dedicated to their mission. But the Knights Templar, unfortunately, according to the official account, decided to embrace the concept of wealth, and that they were, in effect, one of the early banking systems, at least according to the official history, that presided over Europe, and as a result of which they were targeted and destroyed by the monarch of France, again according to the official history. And yet, if we look at how they operated, the Knights Templar, if they had stayed true to their original vows, what was closer? What was closer to the original concept of the once great military that defended Tartaria or the Fourth Era civilization? I believe it was the original vows and concepts of chivalry. And I've noticed that when you study this, when you study the official historical account of medieval history, you'll be told that knights only applied chivalry to noble ladies and nobility. They didn't apply it to anybody else. But what if it did apply to everyone? What if the reality was the concept of chivalry, the concept of humility, of actually embracing and defending others, did universally apply to everyone? How much does that change these military orders in our eyes, if that's what they were truly about? And over time, they became subverted. Much in the same way that the leaders of Tartaria were subverted, these knights became subverted and suddenly began to embrace the importance of material possessions, and not just money, but even the idea of money. Strangely enough, the very same things that we contend with every day. Now, I'm not saying that the concept of material possessions in and of themselves are bad. Like everything else, it's how we deal with things. If we allow ourselves to be consumed by anything, whether it's material possessions, love, or anything, it can cause us to do things that we would not do otherwise. Because suddenly we start to value the idea of this over our own self-discipline. We lose our self-identity. And if you look at the things that we contend with every day, it seems as though everything is directed towards keeping us from understanding our true selves. And this is very true when we look at the official historical account of the Knights Templar. This was a military order that had a very noble purpose and seemed to have a very noble method, a methodology behind how they lived true to that noble purpose and those values. Indeed, the Knights Templars are viciously derided as evil, or the antagonists, in the novel Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. You might remember we looked at the Scott Monument when we did our exploration in Scotland. It's a very striking monument that supposedly depicts characters. This is the original depiction of the Knights Templar. Two knights riding one horse, and the reason being because they were impoverished. That was one of their essential vows. Very similar to the Franciscan monastic order in Christianity, that they embraced poverty. And yet there is a conflicting account that says that these Knights Templar devolved into concepts of violence, and they believed in violence and engaging in acts of violence, and that became more important to them, in addition to their valuing the idea of money above all else. And you can find a similar account with the Teutonic Knights, who supposedly took in the remnants of the Knights Templar and then continued their so-called colonization efforts into what is today Prussia. It's very interesting, and this is all the official historical account. Yet, again, there are conflicting accounts that say that these military orders once had a more noble purpose, that knights truly did live true to the concept of chivalry, and that it didn't just apply to a select few in the population, but it applied equally to everyone. So what's reality and what's merely the blended fiction? It's hard to say. And that's all by design. We're not supposed to have a clear account of the civilization that preceded us. Indeed, you're encouraged, and it's quite okay to talk about the Knights Templar once they had devolved. There's an interesting episode of Robin of Sherwood, yes, that show again, that I think tells the entire story of the Knights Templar in one single episode. It's called 7 Poor Knights from Acre. And in that story, Robin Hood and his band of outlaws come across a group of Knights Templar, 7 knights, who had a small object, a gold object that was a depiction of the order of the Knights Templar stolen from them by this individual. As a result of this, the Knights Templar seek to find the individual responsible, kill him, and then reacquire their material item that supposedly means everything to their honor. And in the process of doing so, they kill many innocent people trying to retrieve this object, and they even kill a member of Robin's band. And Robin himself has to actually engage in hand-to-hand combat, in single combat with one of the knights to try to save one of the other members of his band. It's a very well-written story, and it's very interesting how within an hour they managed to summarize the exact progress of the Knights Templar. How they went from being a monastic order that was dedicated to the defense of a society to an order that was self-serving. Supposedly it was about their honor, but the reality is it was about the material item that had monetary value. That's why they went on this little quest near Nottingham, and why they killed innocent people, and why they attempted to terrorize Robin Hood and the outlaws. They even ran afoul of the sheriff and Guy of Gisborne, although the sheriff, acting on his own opportunistic notions, tells Guy to stand down and allow the Knights Templar to hunt Robin and the band of outlaws. Because why do it when they could have someone else do it for them? In the end, Robin Hood prevails, and I didn't understand it at first, but I do now. The knights are stripped of the armor, and then they're sent off on one horse. And you can see that the 2 knights here, without their armor, do actually reflect what's supposed to be the ideal concept for the Knights Templar. 2 knights riding on one horse. I'd missed that when I initially viewed the episode, but upon rewatch for this exploration, I saw the truth in that. And that's what it reflects. It doesn't just reflect that truth for military orders, leaders, or monastic orders. Consider that Tartaria was carved into successor states, ruled by kings. And these are the aspects of Tartaria we're supposed to talk about. And you'll find 3 greater Tartaries or Tartarias all over the map in many different locations. We also have the accounts of madness that gripped the previous civilization. And there's no doubt that there were some people who tried to live true to the values of self-discipline, and they ran afoul of the compromised leaders and military orders, some of which who still acted in accordance with the rules of the old civilization, and others that didn't. And this is likely why we have these accounts of all these strange sicknesses, such as the dancing plague and many other bizarre accounts from our supposed incorruptible mainstream historical account. But I do think there's a lot of truth to this. There is a lot of truth into the history that we are able to see. But what seems to be the consistent reality is that we're only supposed to see the previous civilization as being a failure. We're supposed to question ourselves, and we're supposed to feel helpless, and the last thing we're ever supposed to develop is a sense of self-discipline, a sense of the ability of exploring ourselves and finding our own spiritual strength from within. You need to rely on other institutions. You need to have other people tell you what to do. When you look at how the lands were carved up and divided politically, you notice that as maps become newer, these political boundaries become more prevalent. They're a lot easier to see. Why is that? Why is it on older maps it seems as though there are no true political boundaries? Why do these accounts of mass insanity and hysteria seem to increase in certain times? What makes more sense? Was there really just all these isolated incidences of mass panic going on? Or was it really a population that was trying to struggle to find itself, to understand why their entire civilization was collapsing, why the leaders that they had trusted had suddenly turned against them, and were constantly keeping them turned against one another? Why was the great defense force that they had once relied on suddenly turning to materialism and not living true to the values that they always had? It had to be a very frightening experience for them, and no doubt many did try to find their way back to their own self-internal images, and yet at the same time, they found the people that they had relied on turning against them. And it's safe to say that this mentality, this primary method of operation, continues to this day. It is very easy to keep people turned against one another, and you can find any variety of reasons to turn people against one another. And I have no doubt that even in the grand heritage of the previous civilization, that some groups were told that they were more responsible for the achievements than other groups. It's another way. It's more of a positive way that you can turn people against one another. You can say that some people are more responsible for others for achievements than others. You can then say that those people who are not more responsible are the outcasts from society. They're people who shouldn't be listened to. You can use any number of means to reinforce this. You can use financial incentives, you can use patronage, and you'll see it every day. And no doubt this has been with us longer than we can begin to imagine. That is how the previous civilization ultimately collapsed, how it broke down into successor states, corrupted by the very forces of evil, corrupted from the inside and the outside, disintegrating and eroding, until finally it became vulnerable. Vulnerable by the very forces that it had unfortunately encountered. In its exploration for more land to explore, they unleashed a great evil. An evil that destroyed them from the inside. And there's no doubt that there are concepts of this evil that remain with us to this day. And you don't have to look very far or very hard to see examples of it. Can it be overcome? Well, the reality is, it's still unchanged from when King Arthur said it. Defend what was and the dream of what could be. There is still a very powerful dream of what could be. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome and thank you for joining me for today's theory video into the fall of Tartaria. I thought it was important to look at how Tartaria could have fallen. We've talked about it before and after the reset. We've never really looked though at what the civilization looked like aside from a few vision photos. Today though, I want to consider the theories for how it fell. But to start off, I want to share the approach of the channel. The channel seeks to explore these theories to prove or disprove them. Always maintain objectivity, the hardest part. Reveal and share details of the land with all viewers. Encourage you to seek your own answers, and keep asking questions and we will find the truth. Let's go back to the 5 eras theory, which is what we're looking at. And today we're going to be focusing exclusively on the Tartarian Age, or the civilization that preceded ours, in the 4th era. Recall that it's surrounded by the Golden Age, which we believe consisted of 3 eras, or at least the channel has theorized that, and then followed by our current contemporary age, also derisively called the Plastic Age, the Disposable Age by other researchers, which I certainly agree with. We don't know how long the Tartarian Age truly lasted. It could have been a few hundred years, it could have been a few thousand years, it could have been over 10,000 years. What we know is they had incredible accomplishments in architecture, society, and civilization. And oftentimes we're derided for even suggesting such theories because we are told and reassured that our civilization is the pinnacle of humanity. Yet we see so much evidence that contradicts that when we look at images of what Tartaria could have looked like. And yes, I'll admit Tartaria is a term that we use to refer to the civilization before us. It has many different names. We're expected to believe that there was a civilization called Rome that lasted 1,000 years despite being very corrupt and despite every significant leader in that civilization betraying the other leader. Yet when we look at this civilization of Tartaria, our imaginations are inspired, our hearts are lifted, because in every depiction of it we see a society that managed to work together and achieve balance in a way that we really can't imagine. And when we say achieving balance, what do we mean? Is that just a plug line? Is that just a saying? No. What we see is a civilization that achieved balance between the society and the individual. There was a great society, and yet at the same time, it did care and nurture for the individual. That is the true balance that we see. And this is how you can explain different civilizations, different cultures with different languages working together and achieving a common civilization, because there was a mutual understanding between the goods of society and the good of the individual. There was always something given and something returned on both sides. And we look at what their achievements were and could have been, and we see the remnants of it even today in our own civilization. And that's why we ask these questions. This is something that inspires us just to think about their achievements and how far their society and their civilization really could have gone. It's not just architecture, though. There are still remnants of this everywhere within our own civilization. Many people struggle to accept this, and they will certainly deny it and deride it in any way that they can. Yet, if your eyes are open, you'll see that so much of it remains. Just imagine living in that kind of civilization, one that really cared for the individual as much as the individual cared for society. That was the true balance. We have to wonder if the story or myth of the Tower of Babel was not simply about the languages being confused. Perhaps it was really about the understanding between people and the balance being confused. And that was where the real breakdown started. In this video, we're seeking to explain who or what was responsible for the fall of this incredible civilization. And this is something that compels us in all this research. This video is based on theory and conjecture because ultimately none of us know. The records are lost. We don't have something of an account that we can truly rely on. We have to go off of our research. We have to compare and contrast all the clues that we find. And there are still many clues that you can go out and interact with today physically. There are accounts in the myth, and then of course examining the historical accounts that were given. There's also a bit of a blending between what's real, what may be considered fantasy, and what you can still go interact with, such as the Great Water Tower column that still exists in St. Louis today, in the middle. And yet you compare and contrast those with a fantasy rendering on the left, and then what's supposed to be a concept architectural rendering on the right. Yet for some reason all this feels real. All of this seems like it's something that could have existed and could have been a part of our actual history. And once again, people will deny this and say, well, it's just a water tower. There's nothing special about it. So what if it's over 150 feet tall? Yet we look at other conceptualized drawings in our imagination where we see large hangars and incredible technology, inspired by what's called steampunk. Yet somehow it feels so familiar to us, as though this is something that truly existed in our own history. It doesn't seem like it's that disconnected. We also see the incredible hangars and the remarkable buildings that could have contained such devices. We also have so much imagination for the different methods of travel that could have been used and connected such a civilization. Travel on the ground, travel in the air, travel below ground, with many different means, whether it was airships or other aspects that we can't even imagine. Some of these structures clearly still remain, with all the Union stations and their tall ceilings and all their incredible hardened construction on the inside with materials we can't imagine. Yet we have to accept the fact that the civilization is no longer with us, that it was lost. But why was it lost? This video, we're not seeking to point the finger at any particular group of people, because the theories that we're going to propose involve what happened with the previous civilization. And I believe that we do far too much of trying to blame one particular group of people for why we're in the situation we're in. We're going to look at three options, and the first one is we made it happen. The corruption that is inherent within human beings, and many of the myth stories that we have say that we grew too arrogant in our abilities. It's possible this same aspect could have struck the previous civilization. They attempted to do something using their science or their balance of science with nature to go even further in their capabilities. And in the prospect of doing so, they created a great disaster. Was this disaster some combination of natural and artificial forces that brought about some sort of plasma rain that destroyed the entire civilization? We have many accounts of what appear to be meteorites, although we know they could have many different explanations, striking cities, whether it's Sodom and Gomorrah or whether it's the Peshtigo fire that may have had something to do with what happened to Chicago. We just don't know. We don't know exactly where these events happened in history, and yet at the same time, there are far too many accounts of this to truly ignore. There are far too many images of this to ignore. So we go back to the explanation that it was simply us. Our pride grew with our ability. We saw what a great civilization that we could build. We saw our achievements, and we wanted to see how far we could actually take it. Then we also consider the other stories that we have of a great deluge or a massive flood. Now we'll be told that this flood was caused by some deity, and it may well have been. Yet there's other accounts that say that a deluge may have destroyed a civilization, such as the legend of Atlantis, because, again, it grew corrupt in the fact that all they pursued were their abilities and wanting to expand their abilities beyond what they knew were their limits. And as a result of that, it caused the destruction of their civilization in a way that they weren't able to recover from. And this doesn't just appear from myth, but we also see this reflected in fiction, science fiction, and fantasy today. Think of the stories of old Valyria from the Song of Ice and Fire and how it was destroyed. It was all from the same cause, because the people and the civilization grew corrupt internally, and they sought to expand themselves beyond their natural bounds, and they paid a heavy price for it. Then there's also the concept of conflict, and perhaps the previous civilization simply broke down. The once great threads that were so strong that held that civilization together fell apart. They had achieved too much, and as we always see reflected in our current civilization, there was one group that felt that it was more important than another group and exploited whatever minor or major differences. Ultimately, if we think about it, there are very few differences between human beings. And yet at the same time, those same differences could have been exploited in the past for those seeking power. It is again a recurring theme and a recurring story that we have to face. It's not perhaps the most inspiring of stories, but it is true that this could have been how Tartaria fell, that the civilization had reached its ascendant over hundreds or even thousands of years, and finally it began to fall apart, because they had expanded themselves too far, or they had simply been around to the point where some people believe they could have more. Theory 2, we were corrupted to make it happen. We have many allusions to the fact that there are corruptions within human beings that could have happened from some external force that we can't fully understand. There's a lot of evidence for this in the fact that in our myth and even to contemporary times, we see that the greatest battle seems to be for a person's soul. And it's not just a plug line. There's so much effort that's put into influencing people what to do, what to think, and what to believe, as though we wish to deny people their true individuality and give them an individuality through some other sort of belief set. We have to wonder if this isn't something that's imposed by some sort of external force that we don't fully understand. Because it always seems that in myth and even in fantasy and other accounts, the greatest stories of the greatest civilizations always fall because they become internally corrupted or decadent. Now, this varies from the first theory, and the first theory that we just believe that this is completely internal and this is just human nature. Whereas the second theory indicates that this is some sort of external force that somehow manages to exploit the natural aspects of human existence and ultimately turn human beings against one another. We have other images where we see once corrupted human beings begin to fight each other and they begin to destroy their civilization. They believe that they are acting in the name of righteousness, they are righting past wrongs, or they are simply acting in the name of their survival. And yet every time we have so many stories, and it's such a repeated and recurring story, where we see the people more than willing to inflict horrific acts against one another, all in the name of righteousness. We see that buildings are destroyed, and much, much worse, so many people are killed, all because others are told that it needed to happen. It was necessary. And how many people ever stop and simply ask a simple question as to why they are told to do such actions? Oftentimes we look at the vast levels of indoctrination. And yet in these images we see what can happen when people are motivated to this extent. We see the great human spirit suddenly applied to something very malevolent, and done so without any hesitation, time and time again. We also see this depicted so many times in movies, plots, stories, novels, in our myth. It's all over the place. Until finally, the civilization reaches a point to where it's so corrupted that the internal and the external forms of human beings no longer resemble human beings. They resemble some sort of creature. Now, is this really a physical representation of what happened, or is this just simply an interpretation of people corrupting themselves, that this is what they would look like if you were able to see how they were corrupted? We don't see human beings anymore. We see ghastly apparitions, all over the land. And we see the fact that there's no limits to what they're willing to do. They are completely and totally overwhelmed and controlled by their simple desire to survive and to consume anything and everything that is around them. And it's a story that's repeated so many times. And here we see the final transformation of human beings into these horrific creatures. There's many different names for them: demons, dark angels, horrific apparitions that we can't even begin to imagine. Yet it appears in every single society. It appears in every single myth that this can happen to human beings to where they can become corrupted. You'll see slight variations in what the names are for these creatures or the processes by which this happens. And yet when we step far enough back and we look at this in totality, we see that this is the exact same story, repeated time and time again. And I believe there's a lot of strong evidence for this theory, that there are forces that seek to corrupt us, both as individuals, as groups, and overall as a society. And then finally, the third theory: Tartaria was destroyed by an external force. There are many different accounts from both myth, legend, and fiction where we have some sort of dark, malevolent entity that comes from the outside and that it wishes to impose its will on humanity. We see this reflected perhaps in the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's world, where we see the original Valar, one of the great deities, who had been corrupted and sought to corrupt the natural order of the world, and dedicated his entire existence to corrupting the world. It's very possible that our lands in the distant past could have been subjected to such an external force that sought to destroy the existing civilization. It is possible that that's what could have been inflicted on the previous civilization of Tartaria, that some sort of external force accessing the lands, whether it was through some sort of portal, some sort of interdimensional nexus where there was travel between dimensions or other lands. It sounds far-fetched, and yet at the same time we have so many different indications through many different perspectives that indicate that this is indeed possible. And it does give credibility to the fact that there could have been some sort of external force that attacked the previous civilization, targeting its cities and attempting to overcome it through an external existential battle, utilizing forces and means which we can't possibly understand, given the level of destruction that we see across the lands. Or perhaps it's some combination of these three theories. Perhaps all aspects play a significant part in what caused the fall of Tartaria. There was internal corruption that was inherent because the civilization had been around so long. There was an external force that attempted to attack it physically, but was defeated by the strength of the civilization. So the external force changed its approach. It changed its approach to corrupt the people from within. And we have to ask the question, does that corruption still exist to this day? Is it really the fact that human beings are born to be something inspiring, to achieve great things? Yet time and time again we see how they are corrupted by the purposes of others. And perhaps there's some malevolent entity that we can't fully understand. My theory comes from Neverwhere-land. There's a segment in the 1981 Canadian animated film called Heavy Metal, and this segment was called Neverwhere-land. It's a segment that did not appear in the final film. But just to summarize, this is one of the most disturbing segments you'll ever see, and I'll put the link in the description of the video. In Neverwhere-land, we see the malevolent entity called the Lok-Nar, an entity that doesn't belong on the land that suddenly arrives. It influences and corrupts all the life forms in the land to destroy each other. And in a segment that only lasts 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and even though the animation isn't complete, you get a very dark, unsettling, and terrific feeling that overcomes you whenever you watch this segment. It's very difficult to watch, and I believe the reason that it is difficult to watch is because it accurately depicts what truly can happen to human beings time and time again when they become corrupted internally, when they suddenly find themselves willing to do horrific acts, all in the name of doing righteousness. And I will warn you, this is a very upsetting segment to watch, and it's very difficult. But it does accurately depict what can happen And we certainly have so many examples within whatever history you happen to believe of events like this occurring. And that's probably why it's so upsetting and disturbing to watch, because we can't deny that what we're seeing in this 3-minute animated segment that wasn't even complete, that causes us to feel self-reflection, realizing what we could be truly capable of. We have the ability for greatness. But that's why it's so important that we ask questions and we understand ourselves. That's why I believe it is important that we're willing to explore ourselves and willing to face all the challenges of life, whatever the reality of existence is, with our own perspectives intact. Not unduly influenced by the forces of others, whether it's some malevolent entity or it's something that's simply trying to twist us to serve its own purposes. It's most important that we know who we are, and that's where I find we have the greatest hope for the future. Thank you for joining.
Ah, yes. Civil War reenactments. One of the great traditions of being an American is either participating in a Civil War reenactment or observing one. You see how broadly realistic this one appears to be. We have our Union soldiers and we have our mounted Confederate soldiers. And then we see the other prime factor of evidence for the Civil War in the United States, the many military cemeteries. And to be quite frank, these seem to be the most prominent forms of evidence that we have in the United States that a Civil War occurred. However, we're looking much more broadly than that. We're looking at the Reset War of 1847, or more specifically, a broad range of conflicts that occurred across the world from 1847 to 1870. Of course, if you're a frequent watcher of this channel, you know how we feel about years and what the actual dating system says the real year is. But regardless, we're looking to answer the question on what was the primary source of the orphans for the orphan trains. I was asked that question many times after doing the orphan trains video, and I thought that it's also time to cover the aspect of conflict in the 3 phases of changing a society, which include conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. We look at our 5 eras theory timeline, and we're looking at the contemporary age. We're looking at how we transitioned from the previous age, which we call the Tartarian age on this channel, but it could have many different names, to our contemporary age. We have 3 different theories on when the last reset occurred. And again, this is all dependent on a dating system, which may or may not be accurate, or may be completely fraudulent. We just don't know. But we suspect that the reset occurred either in 1850, 1800, or 1750. In today's exploration, we're going to see an abundance of evidence that indicate that it may have occurred in or around 1850. Again, going off of the dating system that we were given and the points of reference that we were given. Now, we're making some broad-based assumptions that these are correct, the dating systems are correct, and the reference systems are correct. There's another video on this channel that you can watch where we talk about the unreliability of the dating system and how we're really dependent upon the good word of many governments and many institutions, of course the ones that preceded our current governments, because we're questioning the trust of governments, and we know that we don't need to question the trust of our current governments. They have many checks and balances in place. But previous governments that our current governments tell us are not reliable. The Reset War, 1847 to 1870. Now, all of these conflicts that we're going to be looking at were conflicts that occurred in the mainstream account. These are all historical conflicts. And we're going to look at each of these conflicts and how they're related. And surprisingly enough, many of these conflicts are related back to the United States Civil War, which is very strange. What does this really tell us about the state of affairs in the land in 1847 to 1870? We start with the United States Civil War, which seems to be the primary event that was the catalyst for many other events. We're told that this was a great struggle against slavery, and that this occurred 1861 to 1865, the North against the South. While that was occurring, we also had ongoing Native American wars, where the United States government attempted to subdue all the Native American tribes, and this was an ongoing conflict. There were conflicts that occurred during the Civil War, after the Civil War, before the Civil War. There was the Mexican War in 1846 to 1848, where a U.S. expeditionary force went to Mexico and defeated it. There was the Walker War, where U.S. filibuster went down to Nicaragua and took it over, a guy by the name of William Walker, and he was defeated by an army led by Costa Rica, of all nations. Then there were the Irish raids that occurred after the Civil War. Bizarre.
Finally, we go to South America. There was conflict in Chile with the Revolution of 1851. There was the Pereira Revolt in Brazil, 1848 to 1849. And then there was constant conflict in Colombia, 1851 to 1885. So we've already looked at two entire continents, North and South America, what we're supposedly told is the New World, and we see that they are rife with conflict during this particular time. What exactly was going on during the 19th century, or the period of time that we're told is the 19th century? We've only looked at two continents, and we've seen that they've already been overrun with conflict. What about Australia and New Zealand? Well, in New Zealand we had the Maori Wars, and in Australia we had the Aboriginal Wars, which were somewhat similar in their ongoing nature to the Native American conflicts in North America. So it's interesting. We have expeditionary conflicts occurring where nations project military power to faraway lands, which is supposedly supposed to be very difficult and require great logistics. And then we also have internal insurrection. Every type of conflict occurring during the time when technology and communications were supposedly far more limited than they were to this day. Well, let's take a look at another continent. What about Africa? Well, in Africa, we had the Scramble for Africa and New Imperialism, which supposedly occurred from 1833 to 1914. The brutal and bloody colonialism, which European nations tried to impose their will by carving up pieces of Africa for their own exploitation. Another form of mercantilism, if you will, where the people were either enslaved or they were exploited. No doubt that many examples of this occurred. All right, well, let's try Europe. Well, in Europe, we had the revolutions of 1848 to 1849, apparently a massive social uprising against the ruling order, which supposedly the monarchy defeated, and then the monarchy imposed many of these reforms, bizarrely enough. The United Kingdom, which I say is separate from Europe, had the Chartist revolt or revolution in 1848, where a group of middle-class people tried to revolt. And then there were other wars occurring across Europe, and then even the First and Second Schleswig Wars, which involved the Nordic nations and Germany, oddly enough. Russia was involved in the Crimean War in 1853 and 1856, which was another large-scale conflict facing the United Kingdom and France, almost a precursor to many other conflicts to come in the future. And then there was the ongoing Caucasian War, where the Russians were supposedly trying to destroy and defeat many different groups of people who had been forgotten to history, and this had been an ongoing war for many decades prior to this period, and yet when we open up to this period, this war is ongoing. So we see all of this conflict, and to be fair, there is far more detail that I'm covering here. We're just looking at these conflicts in totality. Well, let's go to Asia proper. We have the Indian Rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, 1847 to 1848. China, we have vast conflict. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, which supposedly killed 20 to 30 million people. The Second Opium War, where we had numerous nations, once again, United Kingdom, France, I'm using modern names that say simple, supported by the United States, 1856 to 1860. In Japan, we had the Japanese Civil War, 1850 to 1864, and then a few short years after that, the Meiji Restoration, where the Tokugawa shogunate was overwhelmed and they had to return to the emperor's authority. These are all historically documented conflicts, and you can see that every single continent in the world between the years of 1847 and 1870 were rife with conflict. And not just regional conflicts. These were external conflicts. These were expeditionary conflicts. Was this really what we're told, or was this the Reset War from 1847 to 1870? The agenda with which to destroy the remnant enclaves of the previous civilization that did not go with the reset. Now, there's a lot of evidence that we can consider that shows that this is indeed what occurred. We have all these conflicts that occurred in a short period of time. Consider the analogy of all the city fires that we have, and we look at how if you change one of the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why, you can suddenly change the how. Now imagine if the W, the when, on these conflicts was changed. Imagine if all these conflicts occurred within a much shorter period, say 5 to 10 years. Would we consider this a world war? Consider how many of the leaders in Europe who were connected with the revolution of 1848 to 1849 actually ended up becoming significant Union Army officers in the United States during the United States Civil War. 8 out of 10 pictured here became very prominent Union Army officers. No, none served with the Confederacy, they all served with the Union. And you can see them in the Union Army uniforms. It's an intriguing premise, and what's this really saying? They failed in the revolution, supposedly in Europe, although the monarchies that defeated them, including some of the most fanatical monarchs, ended up imposing many of these reforms, and we're told they just had no choice to do it.
It's a fascinating dichotomy. We also look at the casualties from 1800 to 1899, and of course we see in the early 19th century the Napoleonic Wars supposedly produced the most casualties, but are they even counting any of the casualties that occurred in China? 20 to 30 million would take you well off this chart, or are they just saying that they're spread out? Ascertaining the number of casualties is always very difficult, and whenever you look up a single conflict, say the United States Civil War, depending on the day and the source, you'll get a vast disparity in the number of casualties reported. And of course, they'll try telling you, well, we're reevaluating the number of killed, wounded, died of wounds, sick, injured, etc. And it's a very interesting consideration because they're supposed to be historians. Well, let's look at some pictures of these conflicts, and we'll start with the Crimean War. And we look at this picture and we see what appears to be some sort of expeditionary force, although these are some of the earliest pictures that were supposedly taken, and we have to consider the detail that we see with the land and these ships. What's exactly going on here? Does this really look like an organized military expedition? Now, of course, the historical account will tell us, well, the United Kingdom hadn't participated in a war for some time, and they were simply out of practice. It had been since the Napoleonic Wars and Wellington's great victory at Waterloo that the United Kingdom's great military machine had gotten to exercise itself. Look at this intriguing building. Sort of a pyramid building that looks like it is supposed to serve as both a church. I wonder, did they just affix a cross on top of it, or was it always there? Supposedly this is from the Crimea. Although one wonders on the authenticity first and foremost of these pictures. I guess you can actually see clouds on it, which is always a unique aspect with these older pictures. And what's the actual date on it? And the location, because the reality is anybody can associate anything with any image that they want to, and that's something that we always keep in mind on this channel. And it's important to always ask questions and not be solidified into a particular belief, because if we look at how all systems operate. Here's another picture of what appears to be port operations, and here perhaps we can see maybe a little bit more of an example of an initial military expedition in the Crimean War. And we see some armed sailing ships in the background, which look like they have cannons in them. They're cramped awfully close together, but perhaps that was the realities of the port. We can understand that. It looks like we see some sort of very rudimentary rail checks right in front there, where they're offloading what appears to be the supplies in the crates. There's many different movies that try to give an interpretation as to what happened during the Crimean War, and they're quite fascinating in how they seem to depict a historical narrative. One of the most legendary aspects of the Crimean War is the charge of the Light Brigade. And here, looking at these uniformed British soldiers, we see a vast array of uniforms, and yet does this really look practicable? It's the same questions that we have when we look at the United States Civil War. Yet, oddly enough, there's also something similar about this disparity of uniforms. Is this really one nation's military? Or is this some other military that was actually engaged in an expeditionary operation? Many of these photos give clues that there could be something else entirely going on. And yet, for many people to even ask these questions, they find it very offensive and absurd. Now, if these conflicts did occur as we're told, I don't mean to question the bravery or the valor of these veterans. But we have to ask questions about this because then we see images like this. Look at how well built up that building is, or that post is in the background. And we have, of course, cannons, and then the very well-stacked cannonballs. They look like they're in position to conduct some sort of siege or to bombard the fort. It doesn't look like the cannons are actually in position to defend the fort, but who really knows? We always get so many conflicting accounts with many of these so-called pictures that we have. And here we have more of the classic vanilla sky where you can't see a cloud, and you certainly can't see what's on the distant horizon. I wonder why. Yes, people say I wonder a lot, but if you're not wondering a lot, then you're just taking all these pictures at face value, and you're never really going to get anywhere. This is an interesting one because we see what's supposedly a defensive position, a very well built-up redoubt. We're told that the United States Civil War is really the first modern war where they experienced trench warfare towards the end of it, and yet this looks a lot like trench warfare to me. But I don't know, maybe they just didn't count it as trench warfare because there weren't an extensive series of trenches. Ask a military historian and they'll tell you 10 different things depending on when you ask them and what conflict you're asking them. And no, I don't say that as a derogatory remark towards military historians. I'm merely saying that to consider the fact that there are many different perspectives, even in the mainstream, about what actually happened in these conflicts. Look at how many times the account of World War II has changed in terms of what actually happened, and that was a conflict that only occurred about 80 years ago. Here we see more soldiers, and they look like they're uniformed a little bit more uniformly, if you'll excuse the pun. Yet again, we always get the same feeling that we do when we look at American soldiers in the US Civil War. And again, these are British soldiers, or so we're told. Who really knows? It seems like they're just having a grand old time, and, war is just really a great old vacation. Although if you watch many of those movies about the Crimean War from whatever time frame in the previous decades, it gives you the impression it really wasn't a very fun conflict. And then you also have accounts that medical services were very poor. And you look at a picture like this, and again, you get this impression of the attempt of logistics. Why do all these cannonballs look so old, as though they've been sitting there for decades? Well, it was just very dry and arid, and the wind blew some dust on them, and they just left them there. I wonder who actually piled all those cannonballs there. It just looks like a pile of junk, as though something has hit the land and people are simply responding to it. You also see what looks to be a steam stack in one of the ships in the background. Now, yes, we're told they had that technology at the time and the Industrial Revolution had occurred, of course. Yet there's just so many anomalies in this picture, to include even the structure in the background. And this is supposedly a picture of combat from the Crimean War. Although this is a bit of a rendering, it appears to be mixed with a little bit of a real-life photograph. It's hard to tell. And that's another ambiguity with these photos. And we always talk about or lament the fact that we don't have actual combat photos from the United States Civil War or the Crimean War. Yet, again, this gives me the nature that this is potentially trench warfare, if this is indeed how it happened, although who knows if this is how it happened. If you're in a military expedition and you're attempting to conquer a land, are you really just going to dig in and sit around and do trench warfare? Or are you going to use maneuver warfare? Oh well. Military historians can correct me in the comments. I'm sure they'll enjoy it. Let's go to Japan and the Meiji Restoration. Now, the interesting thing about Japan was that it was under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, and if you've ever read James Clavell, he details it very well, albeit with alternate names, in the book Shogun, about how Japan had fallen under the rule of the shogun, or military dictator, instead of the emperor. Japan is such an interesting place because, to this day, it has a very strong culture and a strong sense of identity, and we see beautiful architecture. And this is typically the kind of architecture that we associate with Japan, these sort of castles, whether it's Osaka Castle or Tokyo or Yedo. This is Commodore Perry, and he led the U.S. military expedition to open Japan to the world. Very fine photograph. He looks like a very squared away and stern U.S. naval officer. I like how he has one button unbuttoned, and it looks like he has another button not quite buttoned all the way. I don't know, maybe he was just a comfortable kind of guy. He looks like he was very easygoing, very jovial. You'd think, though, that if he was taking a professional photograph, and given the amount of time that they put into professional photographs, he would make sure that all his buttons were buttoned and he would look professional and stern. But perhaps because he had the name Perry, because Perry is a traditional U.S. military name going back to the War of 1812, another interesting conflict in and of itself, he didn't have to have his uniform fixed up properly for his picture. And here we see this opening of Japan. There was no real contact between the United States and Japan, at least no formal diplomatic relations until this Perry expedition occurred, again in the 1850s. And Perry apparently forced Japan to accept him, and they just let him in there, even though, according to historical accounts, Japan was very distrustful and reluctant to allow foreigners in their land. Can't imagine why they would feel that way. And for some reason, they just decided to respect this ebullient and very brash U.S. naval officer who put on such a great display that apparently it somehow intimidated the Japanese. Very interesting account. And these are some of the earlier pictures that we see of Japan from the 1860s and 1870s. And again, we see a very well built out and developed infrastructure, many power lines, tracks, and well built out buildings. Not exactly what we'd expect to see for the 1860s, 1870s in Japan. But again, there could be something off on the dating on the photo. It could be from the early 20th century. It's just strange, and again, we have many conflicting accounts from this, and we consider this account of these conflicts that we're looking at. We wonder, is this an accurate photo, or is this something else that's trying to give us a different impression of what Japan was? Or is this really what Japan looked like in the 1860s and 1870s? Well, if this is really what Japan looked like, we have a very conflicting account. And again, another picture of what we're told is supposed to be part of one of the imperial areas in Japan after the emperor had retaken power from the Tokugawa shogunate. And there's many movies made about that. Perhaps the most recent one is The Last Samurai, which is supposedly from that time frame, although it's quite an interesting movie, especially when you consider some of the scenes from it. But look at that structure there, that archway.
there are parts of it that have a very different construction appeal to it, and there's other aspects to it that don't really show what they're really doing. So I'm trying to wonder, what exactly is this showing? Now, this is the steam engine that Commodore Perry apparently brought along with him. Now, imagine loading the steam engine on and off a sailing ship, even a steam-driven one, because Commodore Perry was a big proponent of steam-driven ships. Look at the date on that. 1883? Or is that an I? Come see our amazing steam engine from 1883. It's from the future. Was Commodore Perry a time traveler too? Or is this an old date? What depiction is this miniature steam engine even from? Because that's what we're told that it is. Is this an American depiction? A Japanese depiction? Something else entirely? Is that really an I? Well, if you're interested in the dating system, check out our dating video on the channel. The Taiping Rebellion. Lots of conflict in China during the 19th century. There was an internal conflict between the Qin dynasty and the Taiping Rebellion. Now, details of this conflict seem to be a little difficult to come by, especially if you're not actually in China, but apparently this was a violent internal conflict that involved large armies. Naturally, there's no pictures of it. We only have depictions like this. So if anybody speaks Chinese or is familiar with Sino history from this period of time, I'll admit that I haven't studied it. I have some bare-bones knowledge on what I'm told on the historical account is, so I welcome comments. Yet it seems like it was a very brutal conflict, and some accounts say that 20 up to nearly 30 million Chinese died in this conflict. It sounds far more brutal than the United States Civil War was, which even at the highest end was 1 million Americans that had died. So what was really going on during this time frame? It's very difficult to decipher if these conflicts were what we're told they were, or, again, were these conflicts really an expeditionary force that was going about destroying the enclaves, the remnants of the previous civilization. When you factor in even the historical account that there's only 23 years dispersing these conflicts, and many of them occurred during the same time frame, you're given the impression that it seems like there's a lot of holdout enclaves. There are settlements with walls around them that are under siege. And why would that come up as a recurring theme? And it seems to be a recurring theme in many of these conflicts. I'm simply trying to interpret what data that we have. It's very difficult to get a clear picture. And that's why this kind of research can be very ambiguous and, to be honest, frustrating at times. We just want some clear answers. We would like some solid answers, some solid evidence that tells us what's really going on. Okay, if this was a civil war in China, we understand it's a terrible thing, war. And yet it seems as though the entire land during this time frame was just overwhelmed with war, internal and external conflict. Why is it now it seems as though everyone, at least in the Western world and modern media sources, are perfectly content to have all their attention focused on one regional conflict, which on the surface is only really between two nations? Yet during this time frame, it seems as though we have more conflict than we did in World War I and World War II combined. A lot of alternative researchers will point back to what was called the 7 Years' War, or the French-Indian War, depending where it was, 1756 to 1763, and state that that was World War Zero. And here's one of the few pictures that we have of the revolutions of 1848, and this was the Chartist movement in the United Kingdom. Very interesting. This seems like a photo, although does it really seem like a photo? We've looked at it before on this channel. See a very large compound in the background with some impressive buildings and a large smokestack. We see many individuals wearing top hats, and supposedly this is a meeting of the Chartists, the group of people that wanted more rights, especially for the middle and lower classes, or so we're told, and that supposedly this was an offshoot of the social upheaval that was occurring in Europe at 1848, even though this is in the United Kingdom. Now, the revolutions of 1848 are something you will find virtually no pictures of, and in my research I could not really find any pictures, and these were a series of uprisings that occurred against the aristocratic governments across many nations of Europe, Austria, Denmark, and again we have the same kind of pictures. It looks like there are settlements that are under siege or being assaulted. What exactly is going on here? We also have a similar feeling or theme that we have in the United States Civil War, and of course many people will be saying, well, it's in the same time frame, they wore the same uniforms, they used the same tactics. What's interesting though is the vast disparity in casualties that you get in many of these conflicts, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But look at this, and look at some of these uniforms. even though this is in Europe, there is a very distinct feeling of, and I'm not trying to offend anybody, I'm just calling what I see. It almost feels like this is something else from the United States Civil War. If you change those flags to red, white, and blue and put stars on them in the field, you have to wonder, is this really depicting this kind of conflict? Is this really what was going on? I mean, yes, these are all just drawn and painted pictures. Anybody could do these pictures. They could be from any time frame. They could say anything. Yet this is what's being depicted and shown to us. And again, more uprisings and more cities. Again, and again. Whether it's pictures, whether it's drawn pictures or paintings or some combination using some means that we don't fully understand, we see a plethora of evidence that shows similar uniforms, similar tactics, and similar types of operations, which seems to involve either sieges or assaults on cities or settlements, occurring all across the land. That's the key theme that's very difficult to neglect when you consider all these conflicts. It's strange enough that they all occurred within such a compressed time frame, according to the mainstream historical account from 1850 to 1870 or 1848 to 1870, or whatever years you want to go by. But then not trusting when the years actually occurred and seeing our little miniature steam engine before, it makes us call into question the actual dates and the years and what was really going on during this time frame. If you could insert a year or two into a time frame, or if you could simply report events occurring on different years, how difficult could you make it to track the actual course of true historical events? Now, of course, people will say that this is absurd, that would never happen, there's too many overlapping authorities, and there's too much collaboration. Yet here, when you look at this picture, again, I see uniforms that look very similar to what the Union Army wore in the United States Civil War. But of course, you can see whose flags are back there, and you know this is not depicted in the United States. But something about it has a similar feeling to it. It's also intriguing when you consider the fact that so many foreign nations sent officers that served in the United States Civil War, and they were already wearing similar uniforms in the years beforehand. Perhaps I'm simply reading too much into it, yet why in all these photos do these all look so much the same? And this is about the only picture we'll get of the Caucasian War in Russia, which is merely a painted picture where we see the type of conflict that was going on there. It was a long-running, brutal conflict and supposedly had denigrated to the status of a genocidal war. Although, looking at the overall scope of these conflicts, you have to question if this was a genocidal war across all the lands. Because when we look at how the casualties have vast disparities in them, and I'll give an example. In the United States Civil War, we're told anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million Americans died. And then in the conflict that occurred in Canada immediately following that, we're told that only 37 people died when this Irish nationalist force from the United States invaded Canada and had to be defeated by the Canadian militia. Yes, this really happened, 1866 to 1871. I guess President Grant didn't opt to stop this or was too busy with other matters. The Opium War in China is quite intriguing as well, and we do have some photos from that because that's another foreign expedition. So while there was this large uprising against the legitimate Chinese government at the time, 1850 to 1864, there was also this foreign expedition. Now, there had been an earlier Opium War. This was the second one, where the United Kingdom and France, and then with some help from the United States, were involved in China. This is really interesting because you can look at the historical accounts, you can do all your appropriate research, and yet you have to accept the fact that there are overlapping conflicts occurring. There are foreign forces that are involved in a nation, while that nation is trying to suppress insurgents or rebels within its own borders. So every type of conflict, every type of destruction, every type of death that we can imagine, what does this really tell us about what's going on in the 19th century? And I think this is some of the most substantial evidence that we can have. Consider this Opium War where we have the picture here of the well-uniformed, trained and led British Army fighting with the Chinese forces. And then, of course, we see, look at the architecture. Now, again, this is a painted picture, so who knows about the veracity of it, and this could be dramatized. Yet our mainstream account
tells us that these events all really happened within close proximity of each other on the date line. It's another example of the more questions we ask and the more research that we do, if we actually ask questions about it and consider it within the realm of logistical limitations, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And here we actually have a photo showing some destruction and some death from supposedly the Opium War, although who knows? Was it the Opium War in China? Was it part of this overall greater United States Civil War? Or was it really this worldwide expeditionary force that was all operating on the same orders, on the same agenda, to destroy the remnants of the enclave of the previous civilization? Because there's no shortage of cemeteries, and there's no shortage of memories or records from these conflicts. And here's the other aspect of it. A lot of alternative researchers will tell you that you have to completely disregard history if you're going to be successful or effective in this kind of research. My approach, though, has been consider the fact that what if what they're telling us does have a lot of half-truths or even quarter-truths in it? Now, what do I mean by that? Think on the fact that if someone could show you a little bit of evidence that something's true, they can't show you evidence that it's completely true, but they can at least show you one thing that something's true. Here's an example. There's a cemetery. There's names on it. There's ranks on it. There's dates on it. This is a cemetery from the United States Civil War. This is from the Battle of Vicksburg. This is from the Battle of Shiloh. Or in China, this is from the Battle of Beijing or whatever. And then on top of all that, we're told that we have global temperature change that occurred very significantly in the 1840s to the 1850s with the ending of the Little Ice Age. Now, who knows if this is accurate data from the time frame, but again, we're told by our mainstream accounts that this is very accurate and that there was an extreme temperature change at the time with the Little Ice Age finally ending in the mid-19th century. Strangely enough, that overlaps with this period of conflict that we were just looking at from 1847 to 1870. And we have pictures like this, which show what was still going on in places across Europe, the United Kingdom, the United States, where areas were very cold and they were iced over for a grand period of time. Now, granted, you could still go there during winter potentially and see this happening. And I've had some viewers tell me, well, there's just extreme weather factors that can hit places at certain times. And yes, this is all true. But at the same time, this is what our official account tells us happened, that this little ice age finally came to an end, and this time frame just happened to overlap with this period of intense conflict, really a world war if you want to think about it, and something far more brutal than a world war. Oh, and let's also bring up the 1859 Carrington event. The 1859 Carrington event, supposedly there were fluctuations from the sun that caused massive disruptions in telegraph communications. Yet, oddly enough, when you try to verify this event in local media sources, looking at newspapers from the time, whether it's from the United States or Europe, it becomes very difficult to verify that this event truly occurred. Now, if someone out there has some sort of access or some sort of ability to look at different sources and give indications from the time frame that the Carrington event truly occurred, then by all means, share in the comments. It's just strange, though, to consider that. And now let's go back and look at some of these pictures from the time frame of these intense conflicts. So we've had vast climate change supposedly occurring. We've had the Carrington event that hasn't occurred yet at the time of this photo. And we have all this conflict. And yet, here's what a cathedral in Baltimore, Maryland looked like in 1856. Very beautiful, very well built out. I like the brick there, the nice beautiful red brick. And look at that light right there. Of course, we'll just be told that it's a gas light and they had to light it every night. Whether it's a gas light or not is irrelevant. Look at the construction that we have within these buildings and the layout of the street and the sidewalk. Some of it looks like it's very beautiful and brand new, and other parts look very old. Then we go to Paris, and we see how things looked there in 1857. We see very well built out buildings, and we see an amazing variety in architecture. But we have to remember there's all these conflicts that were going on. There was this massive social uprising that occurred in 1848 across all of Europe. And there was supposedly climate change and everything else going on. And yet, I mean, granted, this is another one of those questionable photos because you don't see the detail in the sky so well. Yet we know and believe that there are buildings like this, there was infrastructure like this. and then the Great Eastern at London's Millwall Iron Works and the River Thames in 1857. Again, while the United Kingdom was busy with all of its overseas expeditions and everything else that it was doing. Tell me, does this really look like this ship is under construction, or does it look like this ship is being salvaged? Strangely enough, at how old that large chain over there looks. And I love how we always have the individuals with top hats that are always just sort of hanging around, supervising, or, I don't know, maybe just getting in the picture. It almost looks like there's some sort of survey going on here, and they're all just posing. As though these are explorers who had just arrived in this land and they want to see what they have. And then let's not forget the other great achievements of France. Supposedly they built this incredible viaduct in 1861 to 1863. After the Carrington event, after all these social upheavals and all this conflict, they managed to do all this. It's when you start to take these overlapping factors into account that we're told from the official historical narrative. That alone, regardless of whatever you think about the actual years or dates, that's where you have to start asking some very hard questions. Because the more you look at this, the more detail that you look at it within, you start to have more questions. Again, looking back at Paris, and we see what a beautiful modern city it looks like in 1857. Fairy tale towers everywhere you look. Well, it's Cathedral of Notre Dame, so it was always well built out, and it was amazing what they can do. Yes, of course. And people will tell you it was all because of the Industrial Revolution, and we could achieve great things in the Industrial Revolution. Well, tell me, was the Cathedral of Notre Dame built before or after the Industrial Revolution? I'll just leave it at that. I like the road there where it looks like there's a lot of mud or dirt on it, but I don't know, maybe that was just horse and carts riding across. Look how beautiful and modern those bridges look, though, across the river. Very intriguing and very well in depth. So going back to the 5 eras theory, I think we have a lot of evidence that the reset occurred in or around 1850, maybe 5-10 years before or 5 to 10 years after. Who knows for sure? And I'm basing this on the amount of conflict that we have from 1847 to 1870. I'm basing this on the fact that they tell us there was a major climate shift that may have occurred for a variety of reasons in the years leading up to this. And I'm also basing this on the Carrington event. These events all seem to correspond. Now, could it be possible these are all just false flags or misleading information that we're given? Absolutely. There's a reason why I don't tie myself too hard to these beliefs. We are doing alternative research, which is based on theory and conjecture. We have to ask questions and we have to keep exploring. That is how we're going to find the true answers to many of these mysteries. And these are going to continue to be mysteries no matter what we do. Now consider, I've gone back and I've actually looked at my major theories for what's the reason for the existence of Tartaria in the old world. And oftentimes I go to theory 1, we've experienced 5 ages or eras of time. But the more I look into things like this, sometimes I wonder if it's theory 3. Are we living in a simulation? Why do we have so many inconsistencies with our timelines and so many reality glitches? And depending on who you talk to, different people have experienced different realities. And they really believe that they have experienced different realities. It's not something that people are making up. Now, of course, you can just sit there and pretend that everything is just fine, and it's just because people have fallacies in their memory. But, of course, these are the same people that will be told that other fallacies or things that conflict are true because certain authority figures tell them that that's the way things should be. And they will not question it. And, of course, you can see these real-life examples every day. I don't have to tell you examples of people simply adhering to authority. Just go out and walk around and you'll see it. Or is it possible we're living in a dream, our own or another? You know, I always keep these theories on the table because when you look at all this conflicting information and you see just this one historical account of a time frame from 1847 to 1870, 23 years, it's a lot of questions that come up. And I think this is one of the things that shows why we have all these questions. Now, going back to the original point of this exploration, the origin of the orphans, I have some theories to explain where these orphans came from. Now, I believe there were 2 different phases of the orphan trains. There was the initial phase in 1850 to 1870 and a subsequent phase that occurred all the way as far as the 1930s and the 1940s. And here are the major theories. 1, the Reset War destroyed remaining enclaves of last civilization. So what remained of Tartaria that didn't go along with the reset? It had to be destroyed. Prisoners were taken en masse from these conflicts going on across the lands. And many of them were taken to either asylums or prisoner of war camps, where many died. Orphans from across the land were shipped to New York City,
And there they were distributed across the United States because, for whatever reason, the plan that they had indicated the United States was going to be settled from people from across the world. Now, going back to the orphan trains, people say that in the pictures they only see one particular type of appearance of human being, and that's very true. However, just because there's a lack of pictures of other types of human beings doesn't mean that they weren't part of the orphan trains as well. For example, just because the media doesn't talk about a certain conflict going on in a certain part of the world doesn't mean there's not a conflict going on, right? In any event, it's hard to say exactly what the reality of the situation was. But I suspect that the reason that they do this is just to keep people questioning and just to sow division, as because what you display in pictures can always be questioned, and it can always cause people to question their status in life and stay more concerned about questioning their trust in each other as opposed to questioning trust in, we'll just say, institutions perhaps they're not supposed to. Finally, what's the repopulation aspect of this? Consider if we had a reset and a worldwide conflict, we know that many human beings died. We're under the impression, and this is reinforced by the fact, that labor was required, especially in certain areas of the world, and they used child labor quite extensively. The orphan trains initially were designed to provide child labor, and it seems they were provided to induce diaspora and dysphoria amongst the people. There's also the fact that there was a vast population influx in the United States through San Francisco, as we talk about how the Transcontinental Railroad was supposedly constructed by two different ethnic groups of people working from the east and the west and meeting in the middle. Well, what's the truth and the reality to it? We just don't know. We have all these hints and all these clues, and this is why we have to keep doing this exploration. I hope today's exploration provided a theory, though, for where these orphans may have come from. And could they have grown additional people in test tubes using alchemical processes that would have provided more of a population, or the incubator babies? Absolutely. And I believe that was a subsequent phase to the plan when they required more people and more labor in certain areas that were depopulated from all this conflict and everything else that was going on as part of the reset. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Welcome back to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Now I'm going to be honest with everybody. I was looking to take a day off from doing a video, but after receiving some very warm, heartfelt comments on yesterday's video, I thought that when someone suggested that I was releasing too much content, that I owed it all to you, my loyal viewers, to do a bonus video for Thursday. So here's the bonus video, and we're going to be exploring ghost cities or planned cities, and what meaning could they potentially have for this research that we're doing. So what exactly are ghost cities? Well, let's take a look at US China today and see what they can tell us about it. Cities lost in limbo. Are China's ghost cities here to stay? China's record number of vacant houses and urban projects, sitting at over 50 million units and growing, are an increasingly worrying domestic challenge. Known as ghost cities, these developments have created a housing bubble, representative of decades of Chinese progress, but also turmoil. What else would it be? You can't have progress without turmoil, and vice versa, right? The phrase ghost city might imply a city once full of life and now abandoned, but China's ghost cities are brand new, and their high-rises never populated. Many had remained that way for years, byproducts of rapid economic growth that continue to plague the nation's urban planning strategy. Oh, nation's urban planning strategy. Interesting. Today, this abnormal trend should be re-examined in the context of a nation turned upside down by a global pandemic. The saw population migrations and a change in the way people live and work in cities. As the world continues to create its post-pandemic normalcy, urban planning and land development are key considerations. China's ghost cities did not experience significant pandemic-driven influxes in demand, but they are beyond saving. In fact, concepts like social distancing, work from home, and new green initiatives may very well help to drive the next generation of China's urban transformation framework. Whether this spells success for the existing ghost cities is unknown, but at the very least, we can definitely expect to see unprecedented shifts in China's ever-growing urban landscape. It sounds so dire. Well, here's what we're really looking for. What is a ghost city? Ghost cities come in many shapes and sizes.
While information about them is scarce, of course it is, studies have identified some 50 municipalities of varying sizes, often labeled as development areas, new areas, or eco-cities. There's that term. I guess that doesn't mean engine cutoff. They are often located on the outskirts of second and third tier Chinese cities. Most are fully completed, but some were suspended mid construction. Miniature replicas of London, Paris, and European villages have low residency rates, making them perfect venues for wedding photo shoots or film sets. Why on earth would they make miniature replicas of London, Paris, and European villages? I mean, I know Solvang's a pretty little town in California and it attracts a lot of people for its references to classic European villages. But why on earth would you see this in China? Very interesting. The term ghost city was first used by photographers and journalists documenting the Kangbashi district. Located in Ordos, Inner Mongolia, Kangbashi is one of the largest and most well-known ghost cities, originally designed to accommodate over 1 million residents. The urban mega project only housed around 20,000 people. Came up a little short of that 1 million, huh? When it gained international attention around 2009, when journalists flocked to Kangbashi to document its impressive but empty landmarks and buildings. In the years since, the world has directed more attention to these intriguing urban megaprojects, but data from local Chinese governments remains scarce. Why on earth would that be? What we know is that apartments erected in ghost cities are rapidly purchased by homeowners who have no intention of moving in, and prices steadily increase. The result is a massive and worrying property bubble. Really? In the face of China's never-ending urbanization spree, why are there still so many underpopulated cities? Will China's new initiatives focus on pandemic recovery and environmental sustainability finally challenge the standards of urban planning and shine a light of hope on the future of these cities? What does the future of urban planning look like for China? It's a very good question. According to Max Woodworth, an expert on Chinese urban development, understanding ghost cities requires knowledge of two main factors: the reason houses were built and the reason people buy them. Sounds like Real Estate 101. Let's see what he has to say. Most new urban projects are commissioned by local governments. Officials typically spend anywhere from 2 to 5 years in a regional position before being transferred to Beijing. To improve their track record, local officials often fight to demonstrate concrete economic growth and local development during their term. And here's where we have the money shot right here. Deciding to build a new town is just one simple way to demonstrate results, Woodworth says. Officials have a strong incentive to construct new cities, as they indicate economic progress in a clear and measurable way. In the late 20th century, many local governments had abundant land that they could lease out to developers to boost economic activity, which kick-started the city-building trend. Well, let me get this straight. They're saying that if you want to show that you're successful and you want to work your way up the very well-known, or at least reputedly, bureaucratic Chinese government, then you're just going to build a city to show economic progress, regardless of whether it's needed or not. This is very intriguing. And we're to believe that local officials on their own initiative do this? So we go back to the photos that we have of Paris, France, an empty city that we had looked at before in a previous video on this channel. And of course, we know there could be many reasons for why we have empty streets from the 19th century in Paris, France. Could have simply been early morning hours and nobody was out and about, or maybe they were told that there was some sort of strange green gas that was floating around that was going to turn their bodies inside out if it touched them. Remember that episode of The Simpsons? It was one of the Treehouse of Horror episodes. In any event, we do have these pictures, and they're a little bit strange because do they show an empty or abandoned city, or do they simply show a city that has no signs of life and no activity, of which there could be numerous explanations for? Not sure, but why would anybody go to all the trouble of going to Paris, France, and not take pictures of the population? Well, maybe they just wanted to get some pictures of the great buildings. Well, why would they want that? Well, we'll stop asking questions. And here we go to one of our cities in China. And this is the one that obviously has the Eiffel Tower. How fitting, just like Paris. I wonder if anybody in France would feel offended by this, that China's simply ripping them off. Well, I guess they've got the Eiffel Tower that's in Las Vegas, and nobody feels offended by that, do they? I mean, it's just Las Vegas. Pretty decent replica, I've got to say. Although none of the rest of the city remotely resembles Paris, it's intriguing that they put the Eiffel Tower at the center here, and they're looking for some sort of draw to it. I don't know, do a lot of people in China have dreams of wanting to live in a city that resembles Paris, or do they just think it's really cool to have an Eiffel Tower there? I mean, we can see that this thing is pretty large. It's just strange. What do you think in the comments? What's the reason for this? Does anybody live in China? Is anyone affiliated with someone who's involved with this development project, or one of these so-called local officials that we're told about in the article who just decides to take this kind of initiative, and apparently they can. So, I don't know. Could the article be wrong? Everywhere we look, we see these lines of buildings that just go on and on and on. All this residential housing. The article makes it clear that these cities do exist, and yet they are not remotely close to being populated. 20,000 for a city of 1 million? 50 municipalities? And it's nothing to sneeze at. And of course, we're told that the population of China being well over 1 billion for many years now. Does this have some other purpose, though? And that's the question we have to ask. These planned cities that they just build, as though they've really gone with the whole mantra, if you build it, they will come. Yeah, I know, it was he will come. Look at this, just all these high-rises, all this office space, all these residential areas, all this commercial space. And the article did acknowledge the fact that government is spending a lot of money just to keep these places operational. What is really going on here, though? Why would they do this? And why would they commit these expenditures if they don't have a reason to? When we look at the development of many cities in our history, and we always know there was a reason to build a building, or at least the reasons that we're told. Many of the naysayers will tell us that in the 19th century you had these robber barons, and they wanted to build these elaborate buildings, and this was how they showed off their wealth, their status, and their power. Okay. And yet we have an article that's telling us this is done for the same reason. That these cities are built just so a local official can show off their economic development prowess. It's eerie how there seems to be a lot of similarities and parallels in these accounts. What is truly going on? Is there some more sinister purpose behind these planned cities, or these ghost cities as they're called? I don't think I've ever heard any accounts of any of these unused cities ever being torn down. So all these buildings and all of this structure and infrastructure is still there. Unoccupied, just sitting there. And the more of these images you see, the more eerie that this becomes. I'm reminded of the early 1970s science fiction movie with Charlton Heston called The Omega Man, when he's driving around Los Angeles, and apparently they had to film that on the weekend. And of course we're just looking at images, but we have multiple accounts of these ghost cities in China. And it's interesting because this phenomena is not just confined to China. We go back to our 5 eras theory, and we have to wonder, is it possible that someone could be setting conditions for another sort of reset? Are they looking to continue to change what we have on recorded history? Is this one of the first indicators with these ghost cities, or these planned cities, that they could be doing something to serve this end of continuing to confuse what our awareness is of our true history and our own identity? Or so let's go to our friends at Encyclopedia Britannica to give us an account of one of the so-called planned cities in Turkmenistan, the national capital no less, Ashgabat. Ashgabat, formerly Ashgabad, and many other names. From the period of 1919 to 1927, it was known as Poltoratsk. Poltoratsk, city and capital of Turkmenistan. It lies in an oasis at the northern foot of the Kopet Dag, Turkmen Kopet Dag range, and on the edge of the Karakum Garagum Desert, about 19 miles, 30 kilometers from the Iranian frontier. So the capital's not that far from the border. Intriguing. It was founded in 1881 as a Russian military fort and took the name of the nearby Turkmen settlement of Ashgabat. It became the administrative center of the Trans-Caspian Oblast province, and because of its position on the caravan routes and on the Trans-Caspian Railway, attracted a population that numbered more than 45,000 by 1911. If you found it, they will come. After the Russian Revolution, the city soon was renamed Poltoretsk after a local revolutionary. And anyone, feel free to correct my pronunciation. From 1924 to 1990, it was the capital of Turkmenistan, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In 1927, it reverted to its original name, Ashgabat. One of the most violent earthquakes ever registered in the region virtually destroyed the city in October 1948. It was rebuilt on the same regular plan. So again, we have this interesting city with this account that we're all too familiar with. What are the odds? A chronic water shortage was alleviated considerably when the Karakum Canal reached the city in 1962. In 1992, the government of newly independent Turkmenistan officially adopted the Turkmen version of the city's name, Ashgabat. Ashgabat is now an administrative, industrial, transportation, and cultural center. The city has glassworks, carpet weaving, and cotton mills, and metalworking shops. Its spectacular natural setting also made it a center for the filmmaking industry. There are several institutions of higher education, including Turkmen A.M. Gorky State University, 1950, and Polytechnic, Agricultural, and Medical Institutes. The Turkmen Academy of Sciences, founded in 1951, they just can't resist, includes the unique Institute of Deserts. Wouldn't mind studying there. I wonder what that would be like. Other amenities include an opera house and theaters, as well as several museums. Population as of 2007 estimated to be 750,000, give or take. Very intriguing. Let's take a look at Ashgabat. Looking at Ashgabat, we see the beautiful presidential palace. I believe that's what this structure is. Although, in the interest of full disclosure with you viewers, there is a lot of conflicting accounts about Ashgabat, and that's the reason why I stuck with just the Encyclopedia Britannica. Any sort of media entry or traveler's entry, and they classify the city as strange, they classify it as a closed, oppressive regime, and those may be true facts, or it could be something else entirely different. So we're just going to look at the city based on the small account that we got from Encyclopedia Britannica and take it at face value. And what we see are some very beautiful and well-developed buildings. We're told that this is all white marble, and I don't see any reason to doubt that, although I have not been there, and if anyone has actually been there, please let us know in the comments. But based on the accounts that you do read from some reporters and travelers, all of this is white marble as far as the eye can see. It's very beautiful and it's very impressive. And it shows that a modern city can be constructed with artistic inspiration. It is certain to say that a lot of what we're looking at surpasses in beauty the so-called brutalist or even the contemporary quote-unquote postmodern architecture or interior design that we're subjected to, especially in our modern hotels across the United States. I haven't stayed at modern hotels in other nations, so I can't speak for them, but I can say that my hotel experiences in the United States have been lacking. It's one of the main reasons why I prefer bed and breakfast. But just look at this beauty. The visual beauty is very striking. This looks like a city that, even if you are in a desert, you're not going to feel like you're in a desert. They've done a very good job of giving it that oasis feel, and yet there's so much beauty and brightness everywhere you look, along with some very creative, artistic designs. Look at some of these buildings and the layout of these parks. Geometric designs. It's almost as though it's advanced in a way that we can't even begin to imagine. Looks like you got a little pyramid over there, or a built-up building. And just some of the other building designs. We're not seeing our usual square block designs. I mean, we are in places. Yet it looks like they put a little bit more effort into making this more of a beautiful city aesthetically. Why is that? And why do we not see that in our modern cities across the so called Western world? It's very strange. And again, this simply increases the number of questions that we would have about this sort of city. Now, this is not labeled or listed as a ghost city like we just looked at in China, but this is in the same continent, albeit further to the west in Turkmenistan, a former Soviet Socialist Republic until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Look at this. And I can look up the name and the function of this, but what is its real intention and purpose? Is this just a decorative building? Or does this have some other purpose? And I've looked at it in some of the media entries, and I'm not sure if I'm even going to buy what they're trying to sell by saying that this is just merely a ceremonial building where people will get married at. Does this have some other purpose? Could it have some other purpose potentially in the future? What do you all think? Let me know in the comments. It's beautiful. I especially like the golden sphere in the middle. I mean, is this just as it appears? This is just some unique building that was just built out there to gain and garner attention. It does have artistic beauty to it. And there is some variance in the structure. And then look at these structures. Now, we could argue that the one on the right has, some of those lovely right angles to it. But still, it looks as though at least they're trying to bring out some unique buildings. What's really the explanation behind this? And what are they really attempting to achieve here? The other interesting thing is a city like this in Central Asia with this kind of beauty. And I can recall the last time that I was in the Middle East, and it wasn't that long ago. It was the late 2000s, early 2010s. I was in the Middle East, and I certainly don't recall seeing this kind of beauty. There was definitely some ancient structures that were around and a lot of ruins, but not a modern, beautiful city like this. What is really going on with Ashgabat? And how does it fit in with So now we go to take a look at Astana, Expo City 2017, Astana, Kazakhstan, from our friends at World Construction Network. Expo City? Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill Architecture will design Astana Expo City 2017 in preparation for an international expo being held in Astana, Kazakhstan in 2017. Nothing suspicious here. What other gold nuggets do we have in this article? Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill Architecture will design the Expo City, yes, in preparation for an international expo being held in Astana, Kazakhstan in 2017. The architects were selected after an international design competition. Does this sound familiar? Astana Expo City will be located south of Bayturk Tower and east of Nazarbayev University. The expo will run for 3 months, starting from 10 June 2017. I wonder if they had 40, 50 million people attend. Future energy will be the theme for the expo, which will focus on discovering innovative developments for the energy sector, as well as promoting alternative energy sources and cleaner modes of transportation. The Expo City will be developed in 2 phases, with Phase 1 scheduled for completion in December 2016. What, they're not just going to throw it up in a couple months? Immense detail. Well, what do we got for design details? The most significant feature of the Expo City will be Kazakhstan's sphere-shaped pavilion, which will be spread across 24,000 meters squared in the middle of the city. Featuring a convertible outer layer, the pavilion is designed to control the entry of light and simultaneously reduce heat loss. The buildings will highlight the salient features of its site and culture and include sustainable characteristics. Different buildings have been designed to reduce energy use, harvest additional energy, and improve comfort levels. The energy output of each building will be managed by means of multiple integrated systems. High-performance glazing will be featured in the buildings to capture more solar heat during the winter and provide shade during the summer. The temperature within the buildings will be controlled by modulations, while energy piles will decrease the site's energy demand. Interesting. What else have they got to tell us? Phases of the Astana Expo City. The first phase of the project, named the Expo Mode, will cover the design and construction related to the Expo. The buildings constructed during this phase will include central Kazakhstan corporate and international pavilions, as well as hotels and retail and performance areas. So again, this reads just like a classic World's Fair. To attract international companies and entrepreneurs, Expo-related infrastructure will be converted into an additional 700 residential units, as well as office, hotels, local markets, civic and educational facilities. Master plan details. The master plan for the Expo City is based on weather conditions, cultural context, and land accessibility related to the project's location. The covered city concept will connect important landmarks, including Nazarbayev University, the train station, and the Expo buildings. It has been designed to be pedestrian-friendly and accessible throughout the year. It sounds just like Chicago World's Fair, doesn't it? A public park will also be part of the Expo City, which will be connected to a larger park system. The master plan includes the construction of a smart energy grid. Oh, there's that word again, smart. An integrated waste management system and interseasonal underground and thermal energy storage areas. It has been designed to reduce total energy demand, water use, and waste targets. They really emphasize that. All right, let's take a look at Astana and see what this expo provided this city. So it's the same old story again. We have an expo, we have a World's Fair, we have architectural competitions, and here we see the beautiful city of Astana in Kazakhstan. Just unbelievable beauty everywhere you look, and you actually see they're attempting different architectural cues. We see some domes, we see some pyramid structures, some unique buildings that are covered in what appears to be gold, although who knows what it is really. Just this view alone is artistically impressive. And what exactly are we looking in between? I'm sure there's some naysayers out there that'll say that the entire building is, or the entire set of constructions, such as this building, are made out of paper mache and that good old stucco. But look at that dome and the tower on that. It's still a beautiful building. Yes, it's a modern building, but you get the feeling that they put some effort into it. I mean, look at the beautiful park that's out in front of it. What exactly is going on with these cities? I mean, we know they're not planned cities, but yet they seem like they're planned cities. And yet, in another respect, they very much are planned cities, with what we see with the architecture, and there's something very different about them. Now, is there a reason for us to be concerned about this? This is supposedly a shopping center. Imagine going to a shopping center that looked like that. Now, I don't know if any of these accounts or what I'm reading is correct, so if anyone has been there or if they have better knowledge, please share, because I've not been to Kazakhstan, Astana, and I don't know if the accounts being related on these buildings are true. But the fact that they had a World Expo there, I mean, doesn't that tell you that it's a beautiful member of the international community and therefore everything that happened there was appropriate? It's just beautiful. And again, you see something unique with this kind of design. At least they're trying something different. Credit has to be given. Now, does it have sort of a Vegas appearance to it? I don't think so. There's something beautiful in what they're attempting. See the golden sphere up there in that little tower? I mean, what exactly would you call that kind of structure? How would you classify that? I'd be interested to hear what sort of architectural terminology they'd have for this. Well, this is desert image reflective beautification, or something about being in the mountains, or, granted Astana is not nearly in the desert like Ashgabat is, but still, you have that feeling that you're in some remote location. I mean, look at this. You see these different structures and you see these different aspects that they're attempting. Now, could we say that these may be just simple materials that are just configured in a more artistic way? I mean, look at the pyramid. You could easily film any number of science fiction, fantasy, or if we did alternate world, parallel reality movies, or alternate history, which we're not very big on. But look at this. And I think those were the pillars that initial picture was looking out at. And I wonder what those are made out of. What's the construction materials that these buildings were made out of? I mean, we're told that Ashgabat, the city we just looked at, is all white marble. But what exactly is this? It's beautiful. I like the little blue dome. That's definitely a unique touch. Then we've got that little pyramid back there. And then the little tower behind it. I don't know. It almost reminds me of Romulus from Star Trek The Next Generation. The one occasion that we saw it. Very, very beautiful city, though, in the fact that they're trying something different. However, at the same time, we have to wonder what's going on. And this is one of the hotels, and we see through this amazing entryway a view of what we're told is the shopping center, but who knows what the function of all these buildings are. This does have a hotel sort of appearance, but it's beautiful. It certainly exceeds anything that we see that's being built in the United States today, which I'll just use as a comparison. So why is it that Ashgabat and Astana have the beautiful, amazing buildings? Yes, we see the modern construction cues, and there's no doubt that a lot of them fall into these buildings. But it seems as though they're at least trying something different. But why does it seem like they have the license to try something different? Or why is it the plan revolves around constructing something very different? And then, of course, this is the gorgeous pavilion. And here it is in its realized glory. And perhaps this is just a structure that is simply put together and is constructed of very easy to obtain materials and wasn't that difficult. Not denying that. I mean, this is a modern city, but what I'm really questioning is why do we have this kind of beauty in this city that we don't have in other cities? And of course, we'll have the usual array of reasons, and I certainly invite you to let me know what you think in the comments. Is there something more insidious, though, behind these planned cities, or these ghost cities in China? And of course, they even have an opera house with beautiful columns and the classic pediment, as though we're going back to Rome. And I wonder what this one's made out of. And I'm sure the naysayers will say it's made out of paper mache and balsa wood, and it'll fall down in the first windstorm, and somehow it'll last for a while. Still, I doubt that they would construct something like this. So what's the story behind this opera house? Well, who knows? Still, looking at all these buildings, is there reason for alarm? Is there some purpose behind these certain cities, these planned cities, these ghost cities? How does it factor into what's coming in the future? And last but not least, just in case anybody, especially from the United States, is feeling a little underwhelmed about our buildings, I just thought I'd showcase the Holiday Inn Express that's been provided $43.1 million in a construction loan in the fine city of Nashville. Nashville also has its own version of the Parthenon, which is quite fascinating. And yet for $43.1 million, this is what you can build. I wonder what it would cost to stay there. Probably $400 a night in king-size bedroom, and you could hear your next-door neighbors breathing at night because, you know, those walls are well-constructed and thick. Let me know what you think in the comments. What is really going on with these ghost cities and these planned cities? What's the story behind this, and what are their purposes?
Zardoz speaks to you, his chosen ones.
Warning! Zardoz may have a strange effect on the mind, especially if viewed alone. This film has many interpretations. View at your own risk. The Restitutor Orbis channel does not endorse, nor does it discourage the viewing of Zardoz. As always, it is left to the viewer to decide. Well, now that we have that warning out of the way, let's go into our analysis of Zardoz. Zardoz. This is a film that's haunted me for many years in my life. I remember when it all started. It was when my brother brought home a VHS cassette tape called Zardoz in the early 1990s. I saw this movie and I thought, wow, a 1970s movie? Science fiction? Directed by John Boorman, starring Sean Connery. This must be an incredible gem. I was thinking movies such as Logan's Run, Star Wars. And yet, when I put the VHS cassette in the VCR and watched the movie, I found something bizarre, beyond the ability of my young mind at that time to truly grasp. What's really the story behind this movie, and why does it apply to our current research efforts today? There's a very interesting story behind the movie Zardoz. Zardoz was made because of the success of Deliverance, directed by British director John Boorman. Now, yes, that Deliverance, the one with Ned Beatty, where they came across mountain men in Georgia, 4 individuals from Atlanta, and found themselves terrorized. Yes, it had Burt Reynolds in it too. Here's John Boorman. As a result of the success of Deliverance and the efforts of his agent, he was given a large sum of money, well, $1.6 million, perhaps not that much, but basically given money to make a film that he wanted, with total creative control. He also managed to secure the acting efforts of Sean Connery at a bargain discount price, as Sean Connery had starred in the last James Bond film at the time, Diamonds Are Forever, for a rather exorbitant sum, and had trouble finding acting roles or selecting them afterwards. So here we have this genius auteur. And for my UK viewers, I want you to know I have the utmost respect for John Boorman. He gave us Excalibur. There will never be another movie made that truly captures the Arthurian legend the way Excalibur did. So John Boorman deserves credit like that, even if he makes 20 Zardozes. However, we know that John Boorman seems to have some sort of connection with the old world, the myth, and many of the aspects of it because of the fact that he made Excalibur. So here he had resources, Sean Connery, and the ability to make whatever film that he wanted with total creative control. Zardoz is the film that he gave us. Well, Zardoz starts out with this floating head with this strange colored-in mustache and beard. This is Arthur Frayne. We don't know this at the time, but he's a member of the group of people called the Eternals, a group of scientists and educated elite who are sealed away in the distant future, 2299 to be exact, and they live away from the rest of the world, which has collapsed in an apocalyptic state. Arthur Frayne's floating head explains that the film is going to be about deceptions, and he even gets very, well, we'll just say he breaks the fourth wall towards the end, saying that those of us who view the movie, what's the whole point of filmmaking? It's quite interesting. I've never seen a film started this way. When you look at the costume, if you want to call it that, you realize that you're watching something very interesting. You've combined John Boorman's unrestrained creative drive with this interesting beginning. And then the opening scene where we see a group of brutals. Now, this is outside of the area called the Vortex, where the Eternals, which Arthur Frayne is part of, live. And all the people who live outside the Vortex, this sealed-off country estate, are called brutals. There's a group of brutals who worship a god called Zardoz, which is where the giant floating head comes from. When we look at the brutals that wear these giant floating head masks, they're considered the exterminators. And the giant floating head is called Zardoz. It is their god. And the brutal exterminators, which are all male, go about controlling the population of other brutals. They are encouraged to kill, and they are given weapons to do so. Weapons which come from the giant floating Zardoz head. Except, of course, for this individual, some of them apparently don't wear the masks because I guess they're just that cool and, they don't need to wear the mask and they worship Zardoz in their own way. It's an intriguing start to the film and there's some very interesting dialogue. I'm not going to share it here, but what it really boils down to is here you see the giant head of Zardoz and the brutals gathered around, and they worship this as their god and they follow all of its dictates. And Zardoz, which is controlled by Arthur Frayne, the Eternal, this is his means for maintaining control of what they call the Outlands, or the area outside of the Vortex. And the stone head provides weapons, ammunition, and guidance for these brutal exterminators. They go around killing the population, keeping it in check. However, the dictates start to change, and Zardoz, the godhead here, tells the brutal exterminators that they need to start farming and enslaving other brutals instead of killing them. Well, one of the leaders of the brutals, Zed, played by Sean Connery, does not find this acceptable and believes that Zardoz betrayed them. So Zed decides to stow away with the grain that they provide the Zardoz head to find out exactly where the Zardoz head goes to. Now, we don't know at this point in the movie what's the story behind Zed, the leader of the brutals played by Sean Connery, but we do find out later. It's intriguing to think that even though this film was a creative mishmash from John Borman's mind, he managed to maintain some coherence in it, and that's not what we'd expect for a cult film. And let me outline that this is the quintessential cult film. This movie barely made a profit. It did make a profit. However, what is John Borman really saying in this movie? Apparently, it started off with him wanting to compare two different societies. But this movie actually says a lot more than that. And it starts with Zed stowing away in the Zardoz head with the grain that they're providing for the Eternals who live in the Vortex. Now, we don't understand the nature of the Eternals. We've only been introduced to Arthur Frayne, who is the individual who runs the Zardoz head, and he also manages the Outlands, where the Brutals all live. But we already see this interesting division between societies, and now here is within the Vortex, the country estate that the Eternals live in. What we don't know at this time is that the Eternals are living in a state of perpetual stagnancy. They have been sealed off for 300 years, there is a force field around their country estate, and you see an interesting mixture of old world architecture with some small pyramids and what appears to be advanced technology. And you also see the bizarre costumes that the Eternals are in. Let me know in the comments what you think about those costumes. And believe me, this film has some very intriguing costumes, to say the least. It's part of its cult appeal, I suppose. However, we see that the Eternals are living in a stagnant society. What we find out is that the Eternals cannot die, and if they do die, they are resurrected in a new body with the same memories. Also, the Eternals live a very meaningless existence. You would think they would be pursuing knowledge or have some other purpose, and yet they do not. And after 300 years of living this way, their society has deteriorated. And here's a group of Eternals practicing one of their meditation rituals, which in the film, meditation has replaced sleep. There is no need for procreation, and so the men are all impotent. Now, in the commentary, John Borman says something about a matriarchal society, but I don't think that's really what he's displaying here in this film, because there's something else controlling the society of Eternals. And here's a big hint, no, it is not any of the humans as part of their society. These are people who have lost their humanity completely. They have no purpose. They have lost even the basic human functions of sleep and reproduction. And they do capture Zed once he arrives in the Vortex, which is what they call the area that they live in. He does kill Arthur Frayne, although Arthur Frayne is of course resurrected, as every Eternal is, because they cannot die, hence the name. They subject Zed to a variety of psychiatric control, or telekinesis. They seem to have powers which we don't fully understand, and we don't understand what's the source of those powers yet. Interestingly enough, although Zed seems to be completely overmatched, his attitude indicates that he is someone who is still not accepting his situation. He goes around to this individual on the left named Friend and finds that large groups of Eternals have become apathetic. They do not move, they simply stand with blank stares all day long. And since they are no longer part of the society and don't make any sort of bread, they needed to have the Brutals outside of the Vortex provide them food. And that was why Arthur Frayne was directed to have Zardoz tell the brutal exterminators to enslave other Brutals and begin farming grain. And that was the event that caused Zed, Sean Connery's character, to rebel. Well, very intriguing that we see that this is the fate of humanity forced to live in the vortex despite having an eternal life but having lost all purpose. What you see depicted in John Boorman's film is a fate that is far worse than death. People who have lost their purpose, people who have no meaning in life, and this is what happens to them. They're reduced to a state of total catatonia, or total apathy. We also see the same warning in the film Dune by Frank Herbert, and it's for the same cause, because of the presence of artificial intelligence. What we learn as the film progresses is that there is an artificial intelligence that controls the vortex, an artificial intelligence called the Tabernacle. Interestingly enough, the human prowess that Zed still has does provide some sort of life for the apathetics, and as he comes around them and establishes some physical contact, it seems to return many of the apathetics to life. And what's this representing? This represents the fact that the brutals, who have a limited lifespan and have purpose in their life, are actually true human beings, unlike the Eternals who have lost their humanity. And we see this represented in the scene. Now, the middle of the film is a very bizarre sequence of scenes, and it's really where the bizarre adjectives come in for this film. It's intriguing as Zed tries to go through the vortex and figure out exactly what's going on. He's subjected to various hallucinations, and here you have the other main characters of Eternals. This is May on the right, and then Friend in the middle. Something else I didn't mention is that Eternals who try to rebel against their stagnant society are aged, and some of them are kept in a perpetual geriatric state, but they can't die, and that's how they're punished. Well, Zed works with these two to try to find a way to overthrow this stagnant society that's not going anywhere and is never going to go anywhere. And many of the Eternals simply want to die. However, there are other Eternals who want to continue the system for some reason. May on the right is a very intriguing character. And this is another picture showing the power that the Eternals have and a representation of their connection with the Tabernacle. They don't seem to understand or are really aware of the fact that the Tabernacle is an artificial intelligence. They originally sealed themselves in this vortex as scientific and intellectual elite to escape the apocalypse that was occurring long before the movie started. And here we have the interesting kaleidoscope picture of Sean Connery. Great acting there in that look. As he goes through his personal quest to try to figure out what's the real story behind the vortex and how did it begin. And we also see the power that the Eternals have. And on the left there we see Quincella, who is the main antagonist through the movie, played by Charlotte Rampling. Quincella wants to maintain the status quo within the vortex, and May on the right, her assistant, is actually subversive and wants to end it. We find out that Zed's life has been one of violence and struggle, and yet at the same time, Zed has meaning in his life. He has purpose, and he has a limited lifespan. We see the fact that he contradicts the existence that the Eternals know and understand. Well, as a result of this, he becomes a great threat, and Quincella there wants to have Zed eliminated. But May and Friend, pictured there, want to use Zed to free them from their eternal imprisonment, in which their lives have no meaning. And this is where we see the real struggle of the film. We see that the way the Eternals live, their lives truly have no meaning. And I think John Boorman did a perfect job of capturing what that existence would be like. An eternal, meaningless existence. Now, some people will say that there's a bit of a gender division in this movie, and I don't think that's true. I think really what this shows is the dangers of control by artificial intelligence, or really turning over control of our lives to any sentient force that is outside of ourselves. Yes, here's the famous image of Sean Connery in the wedding dress. Not only did John Boorman get Sean Connery for a bargain discount, he also got him to show up in a wedding dress. We find out that Zed was manipulated, or rather educated, with the help of Arthur Frayne, who showed him the knowledge, the fact that Zardoz was actually inspired by the Wizard of Oz. And if you didn't figure that out, that's where the name came from. and Arthur Frayne was merely using a deception similar to the Wizard of Oz. In his education, Zed finds out that the Eternals are not an evolution, they are a de-evolution of human beings. And as you see here on the right, that's what this shows. And whatever your feelings on evolution may be, it shows that while there may not be evolution to a superior state for human beings, there is very clearly the concept of de-evolution. Very interesting that John Boorman managed to get this in this film. That people were forced to live a different existence and they were de-evolving. Well, Zed manages to figure out that it is an artificial intelligence called the Tabernacle that controls the vortex. And through a series of very interesting events, which I'm not going to try to explain in this analysis because it's very difficult. You can watch the film, if you're so inclined, and try to come up with your own explanations for how he comes to these conclusions. I will admit, it is a very intriguing series of scenes. But in summary, Zed figures out how to destroy the tabernacle, and there's a very interesting scene where he tells everyone to stay in his aura. Oh, and you've got to see Sean Connery play that. It's quite interesting. He discovers that the force field that prevents the other brutal exterminators from coming into the vortex can be destroyed by destroying the tabernacle. And that becomes his main objective. He does manage to finally destroy the tabernacle, and this brings the force field down. And this is the intriguing scene where he talks to the tabernacle. Now, after he brings the force field down, he has a conversation with both Friend and Arthur Frayne, and it's one of the most interesting conversations that tells you what the movie's really about. And Arthur Frayne tells Zed that he has bred and led him and brought him to this end. And then Zed responds, "And I have looked into the eye of the force that put the idea in your head. You have been bred and led yourself." And that's where both Arthur Frayne and Friend realize that it was the tabernacle that was controlling their lives and had taken all meaning from their lives. Most of the Eternals, once they realize that the force field is down and the tabernacle is destroyed, long for death. And many of them openly invite it once the brutal exterminators finally raid the vortex once the force field is brought down. However, May and the Red and a small group of her followers have somehow managed to reacquire their will to live and find a purpose in their lives. And even though they're going to live a mortal existence, they accept it. While once the brutal exterminators are able to get into the vortex, they massacre all the individuals who openly welcome death as they simply want to be free from their eternal, meaningless existence. And it's right here that we see the true warning of the film. What happens to our lives, what happens to us, when we turn over the control of our will, when we lose our self-autonomy? And this film is a very stark warning. We contrast that with the warning that we had in Logan's Run, and I would argue that it was merely a computer controlling the city in Logan's Run compared to this artificial intelligence. The tabernacle actually showed true artificial intelligence because it adapted to the situation, and that's how it created the eternal lifespan, that's how it created the meaningless existence for these people to live in which they slowly lost their humanity. Remember that in the Matrix films, the most terrifying scene were the machines evolving. And we didn't really see that so much in the live-action films, but we did see that in the Animatrix in the Second Renaissance, where they showed the machines evolving to destroy humanity after Project Darkstar had failed. Well, Zardoz ends with Zed hooking up with Quincella, and they have a son, and the son goes off on his own, and then Zed and Quincella die of old age, and that's how the movie ends. I really wonder what kind of world we're living in, though, with what John Boorman told us and what we see in our real life and what's happened in the decades since this film was made in the 1970s. It's an intriguing aspect to consider that John Boorman, with his own creative influence and total control to make the film that he wanted, made a film that was a stark warning about both the threat of artificial intelligence, the threat of some other form of control, and finally turning over our self-autonomy to others.
And I think one of the reasons he made this film so bizarre was because of the fact that he couldn't have made it directly to state these messages. But if you look, you'll see these messages in this film. Or perhaps you'll interpret it completely different. For those of you who have watched it, or do watch it, please let me know in the comments what you think it's about.